Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show. It is a joy to be with you today on Monday, May 6th. We've got a lot of digging to do, so let's get right to it. We're going to have some students who've been in the encampments, who've been involved in these protests. We want to dispel some of the myths. We want you to hear from them. We've been talking about them. We've had a chance to talk to a couple of them, but more or less, we're going to have a panel with them. And I want Attorney Daryl Jones to talk to us about what the students' rights are. Many of them are being threatened with not being employed. There's just a lot going on at one. We got at one time. We've got to peel this onion, and I want to talk about that. Um, and then what's happening? Who are the counter protesters? Anastasia Sinat, Attorney Sinat, Dr. Gibbs. I mean, what are we looking at? I mean, this is just it's an amazing turn of event. October 6th, who knew that we would be here October 7th and October 8th? Who knew that public opinion would be shifting so radically? There's just a lot that we've got to peel back on. And what is going on with our students? What kind of moment is this? Is this a movement? Is it a moment? Is it a movement? So much is changing in American life and in our world life. Maybe that's what this is. What kind of moment is this? And what are these students telling us? And what are they trying to tell the people running for president? And are those who are running for president listening? Hmm. Got to talk about that. But and in between all of that, we're going to talk about Haiti. I want to keep Haiti front of mind for us because Haiti's in our hemisphere. And the free world owes Haiti a huge debt. Enslaved people overthrew their masters. They overthrew one of the great imperial powers of this millennium. And the Western powers have never let them forget the insult, the humiliation. And we've got to talk about that. There's still there's a state of chaos in that country. And it's not because Haitian people are chaotic and do not know how to govern themselves. It's because they're being interfered with. Gaza, Haiti, Cuba, the global south, all over the world, wherever you see us present, United States, there's money there. There's gold up in them their hills. There's oil. There's all kinds of stuff. We've got to talk about that. But I want to start with you, Dr. David Gibbs. You can only be with us for a short while, but we've got, of course, Attorney Daryl Jones, the chairman of the Transformative Justice Coalition. He's going to be answering. He and Attorney Anastasia Sanat, my brilliant and crazy soror, the president of the Haitian American Lawyers Association. We are Deltas representing Delta Sigma Theta in the house and giving love to all of the Divine Nine. Of course, Mr. Black and Gold over here, the Alpha. We love you. We love you too, even though my dad's a Q, I'm partial. But Dr. David Gibbs, we are watching something astonishing happen, and feel free to jump in, Daryl Jones and Attorney Sanat. But I really do want to give Dr. Gibbs the runway on what we're watching with our young people. We're watching, I think, a complete mischaracterization of who they are when we look at corporate media, um, and a complete misrepresentation of who the counter protesters are. Who are the counter protesters? And why are they shouting racial epithets at Black people and Palestinian people and LGBTQ plus people and uh, and Muslim people? But they are reserving their particular ire for Black people and Palestinian people. And we saw something quite ugly happen at Ole Miss just a few days ago. It looked like we've gone back 60 years, but this is in the fabric of the country. So talk to me. I mean, we've got more than 2,100 of our young people who've been arrested. Bryce Green, who you've been with so many times, we're fighting to get him back on the campus. He's been banned for 5 years, Attorney Sinat, for participating in these protests, for being a political organizer. They even caught the police targeting him on their scanner. They said, no, look for him. Blue shirt, black man, black shorts, Bryce Green, go get him. what are we looking at? I mean, we saw the ugliness in UCLA, and I don't know if people really know that, and I'm going to let you lead into this. For 3.5 hours, the encampment, which had been peaceful, they were attacked by outside agitators. Some of them were students, but we do know that they were the counter protesters, many of whom are white nationalists and self declared Zionists. And that's where we are. And they were shouting racial epithets and they were beating them as the LAPD and the UCLA police stood by and watched. It took them 3.5 hours to go and rescue these young people. What is happening, Dr. Gibbs?
Well, the characterization one often sees in the media, by critics of the demonstrations, these are, this massive wave of anti-Semitism sweeping America's campuses. Jews are unsafe, and so on. Let me just say, as somebody who's spent my whole life in academia, who's on campus almost every day, this is mostly nonsense. There is no wave of anti-Semitism sweeping America's campuses. I'm sure there are instances. There are always some instances. There's always some idiot who's going to say something stupid at a rally. But apart from isolated instances, there's no systematic threat to Jewish students or Jewish people at these demonstrations. Nothing, certainly nothing that I've seen. And, it also downplays the fact that the Jewish community in America is very divided on this. A lot of the demonstrators are themselves Jews. That's just a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the people criticizing the demonstrators are Jews, but a lot of the demonstrators are Jews. And so it really is a gross mischaracterization to say it's anti-Semitic. I remember when Elise Stefanik was grilling the 3 presidents of the universities, she was asking them, would you condemn somebody calling for the genocide of Jews? I have to say, I was quite angry that none of the 3 presidents ever said, you show me a video of somebody doing that on my campus and I'll take your question seriously. But until you show me a video of that, I'm going to think you're making this whole thing up. It would amaze me that these 3 college presidents never really defended themselves very effectively against what was really a quite outrageous smear attack, really, in my view. And so I think this is a real mischaracterization that has to be answered. There isn't a big anti-Semitism crisis on America's campuses, contrary to what a lot of the people in the media are telling you. I do think you're getting pushback from a number of different directions here. One of them is indeed, yes, pro-Zionist, members of the Jewish community are clearly, counter demonstrators. Also, there's Christian Zionists who feel very strongly about this issue. For reasons I don't quite understand, among Christian Zionists, there's always been a strong animus towards Muslims. At least that's the impression I get. What's the basis for that? I don't quite understand. The whole Christian Zionist idea, I don't honestly understand very well, but it's there, and it's clearly a very big factor here. And third, I think what you're getting are just, at least certainly an old miss, and I suspect elsewhere as well, just old-fashioned white nationalists.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Israel-Palestine issue has been a big concern, well, among a lot of groups, but also people of color have been very incensed, I think, is my impression, by what's going on in Gaza. And there's, I think, an instinctive kind of sense of identification with what the Palestinians are going through right now among many people of color. And so you will get inevitably, and are getting, at least that's my impression, people who are more or less overtly racist and white nationalist are participating in these things, just expressing their own hate-based politics in terms of the prism of the Israel-Palestine issue. That's the impression I'm getting. I'd be curious to see what the others think of this interpretation. But in terms of what I'm seeing on videos, that comes through to me pretty strongly. And so I think you get this sort of constellation of forces that are opposing, the demonstrators. And in general, I think the U.S. foreign policy establishment sees America's alliance with Israel as a fundamental projection of American power. The military-industrial complex is closely intertwined with its counterpart in Israel. And so that's another factor here. The mass media, the prestige media, is closely intertwined with the foreign policy establishment. And so I think that's another factor here. The mischaracterization of this as being a crisis of anti-Semitism on America's campuses, which for the most part isn't really happening, I think reflects the fact that the prestige media is still reflexively not just pro-Israel, but strongly favors the nexus between American foreign policy and Israel, and American funding of what Israel is doing, massive funding of what Israel is doing.
Yeah.
That said, I think the demonstrators could do a better job, nevertheless, of presenting their case to the public. I think that I've said this before, but I'll say it again. They really should reach out to elements on the right that do not favor American projection of power overseas, including in the Middle East. There's a significant right-wing anti-war and anti-militarism element that I really do think that people on the left should make common cause with on this issue, and could make common cause with. I think the demonstrators could do a better job of doing that. I think they could do a better job of underscoring again and again the issue that the United States is financing what's going on here. And maybe we shouldn't, the question is not just what Israel is doing, but more importantly, what the United States is doing here. Because after all, most of the people at these demonstrations are American citizens, and they have the right to ask, what is the role of our country in this? So I'd like to see more emphasis upon that issue. So that's my assessment of demonstrators and the counter demonstrators.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, because it seems to me that, and you've got to be very careful when you hurl these accusations of, anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-Muslim or anti-Arab sentiment. They're both Semitic people. That's why
It's true.
I don't even split hairs on that. That's what it is.
Yeah.
But even with anti-Black racism, you have to be careful about these things, because if the charges are found to be false, you can lose your argument. And to me, what I'm hearing, this is a way to silence the dissent by putting that out there, instead of looking at real cases of it. And you have this young man who walked in the middle of the march at Northeastern University up in Boston. And it was a peaceful march, appealing for Palestinian justice. Yeah. And he comes draped in an Israeli flag. He starts yelling, "Kill the Jews." Mm-hmm. And the next day they were arrested. He was not. Mm-hmm. And like you said, presenting video evidence, Attorney Jones, that's easy to do. People take your phone as a camera. People do that all the time now.
Right.
And, you catch people, Attorney Sinat, just making off the cuff remarks, maybe even privately, because you've got your phone running. But it seems to me, Dr. Gibbs, that these university presidents are afraid. We all know university presidents, their job is to raise money.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Yep.
And if they are defanged in that way, if they cannot raise the money, they get kicked out. Mm-hmm. Period. I mean, it's really what it is. I mean, the academics kind of run themselves. So, and then I don't see an amplification of the attacks that Black protesters and Palestinian protesters are taking. They're taking real hits. Mm-hmm. They're being hit harder than anybody else. Why is that not being discussed?
Well, Claudine Gay, isn't she one of the past presidents of Harvard that resigned because of the amount of scrutiny that was brought upon her based on the fact that there were so many students that had taken these positions, and then so many of the alumni that went ahead and they also took those positions, that she wasn't doing enough in order not only to protect the students that were Jewish, but she did not do enough to protect her own personal reputation in that foray of let me get her, all right? Because it was a let me get her attack. I don't believe it was really based on anything that she had really done. But I think that when Mr. Gibbs was talking about why these students are taking such positions and why the media, and I'm not really a fan of the media taking the position that pro-Palestinian is anti-Jewish. I disagree with that. Yeah. I agree that it is not. I have many friends in the Jewish community, and to be in favor of the human rights of one group does not mean that you are in favor of in humanitarian concern for the other group. And I think that a lot of people have taken that position that if you are pro-Palestinian, that means you are anti-Jewish or anti-Israeli. But I don't believe that's the case. I honestly believe October 7th was an opportunity for Israel to get their individuals together, their military, their smart, intelligent people together in order to find who's been on the terrorist list, the Hamas individuals that actually, kidnapped and held hostage all of these individuals. I don't think it was an opportunity for Israel to bomb hospitals, civilians, and take the lives of so many innocent people. And I think that's where the disconnect has occurred within the media.
Well,
I think
but
people
attorneys
wants to support one position, but in supporting that position, they're neglecting the other position, which is one human doesn't want to necessarily take the life of another human. We want all humans to be safe. And just because we want all humans to be safe doesn't mean we hate the other humans.
But you know what? It beggars belief that they did not know that this attack was coming. First of all, they knew Hamas very well. They funded Hamas, Israel did, because they didn't want to fool with Yasser Arafat. I mean, that's just a fact. And so because they did not want to deal with Yasser Arafat, they did what powerful people do. They split the leadership. They literally split the land. You have the West Bank, you have Gaza. And so you got two different head. My pastor, God rest his soul, used to say, a headless thing is a monster. Two heads is a freak. And so what you have, I mean, I'm not trying to be insulting to anyone or to anything, but Hamas has always been a very interesting construct because they have gotten so much money from Israel. They've gotten so much support. And
is the United States supporting Hamas by supporting Israel?
We're supporting all of it because they're a beachhead for us, because after the Second World War, we needed oil. And we need, to me, so much of it comes down to money, Dr. Gibbs and Daryl Jones. And honestly, I said, no, because people, religions, and I'm welcoming Bart Schultz from the University of Chicago to the show. So much of this really is, we just need to stop playing here, really, and let's just deal with, because politics, as I understand it, is about the governing of resources. How do you pass them out? When you look at the reason Queen Elizabeth was so powerful and her son is so powerful, they're the most powerful family on earth. They're the largest landowners on earth, which means they control more water than anybody on earth. That's why they're walking around doing this, smiling, making these royal trips, to inspecting their properties. Everybody can laugh, but it's the truth. It's true. We just need to stop this.
Colonization does exist in modern day form, and we do not recognize it in a variety of different ways.
No, we do not.
When it comes to this particular topic, as to whether pro-Israeli students or pro-Palestinian students, are they truly in conflict with each other, or are they in conflict with what's been promoted, in my personal opinion, with what the media is presenting? And I believe that's what they're in conflict with. It's what the media presents, because they don't really know what's going on there, because they're not there, just like I'm not there.
Well, no, but a lot of them, they're very connected. But what we're doing, I think, we talk around a lot of the real issues. And when you look at land and land ownership in the world, that's the true source of wealth anywhere is land ownership.
Okay.
And that's why I think they push so hard to have land, which is fine.
I mean,
but you can't
Palestine has gone from a country that existed to a country that no longer exists.
No, it exists.
If they're here, we literally consider them to be people who are stateless,
which is ridiculous. But let me spread this around, because it's ridiculous, and now it's become this global conflict that, if we're not careful, it could get everybody blown up. Dr. Gibbs, Bart Schultz, senior lecturer, you do philosophy at the University of Chicago. I mean, take me on a trip here. This is this help me, Daryl Jones. I mean, this is crazy.
Well, I
And
agree with
and
you
the
about
far and the longer, the
crazy
further we get
part.
in, the deeper we get into this, to me, it gets more dangerous.
The philosophers I read and often teach um, do tend to stress things like existential and catastrophic risk, of which there are a number, including unaligned artificial intelligence, and the chances of humanity pretty well doing itself in are, alas, very great.
Dr. Gibbs, you about to say something?
Well, I think that again, the issue I would come back to is that the United States basically has been facilitating what Israel has been doing since the early 1970s through massive financial transfers, basically enabling Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which is illegal, basically, according to UN resolutions. And illegal according to the whole idea post UN Charter, post Nuremberg war crimes trials, that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible. And despite that, the United States has enabled Israel to do this. I should add, it's not just the United States; also Germany is heavily subsidizing the Israeli Navy, including Israel's acquisition of submarines that are likely being used for possible launches of nuclear weapons. And so the U.S. and to a lesser extent Germany are basically making all of this possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I would like to see much more focus on that issue, that if the United States and to a lesser extent Germany were not doing this, it's very unlikely Israel would have ever undertaken the actions it's undertaken now. It's unlikely that we would be the United States officially supports the two-state solution, but everything the U.S. has done has enabled Israel to prevent a two-state solution, which is clearly what at least the current leadership of Israel wants to do. And so that I would see as really the core issue here, the nub of the whole problem.
And I would tend to agree with what Dr. Gibbs has laid out. And I would do a little bit of a different framework than what's been presented, because what folks tend to talk about is being pro-Palestinian, is being anti-Jewish. I don't think that's the narrative that's being driven here. The narrative that's being driven here is that being pro-Palestinian is being anti-American. And the way that it's being presented is that that Israel is Little America, right? Is what they would call it. Whatever you do to Israel, you're doing to Little America. That's the reason why we get the response that we get in Mississippi at Ole Miss with regards to them singing the national anthem and all this other stuff as they're taking apart the encampment. It's not that they're pushing the anti-Jewish thing. They're saying that this is anti-America. Anti-American, and you're against Little America, which is Israel. And so when I start to look at it through that lens and through that view, then you begin to understand, I think, a little more clearly what's happening in Colombia. Why are the police responding and going after the encampers? Those that then would be, by this analysis, anti-America, right? That's who the police are going after. That's who the police are going after in Mississippi. So the steps that they're taking steps that are not protecting those that are against Little America. So that's sort of the view and the lens that I think this should be viewed from. When we start viewing it from that lens, it begins to understand a little more clearly, because if we look at the Republicans in Congress, right, they're against at least they were against all of this stuff about sending money to Ukraine, sending money to all of these places because of financial reasons. Well, if it's Little America, though, they're going to change that tune, right? And they want to protect Little America. And so I think that that's the analysis that would probably be most appropriate in attack and viewing and understanding what's happening here. And I think that when we get to the point of looking at Israel as Little America and the right wing and the counter protesters' response as being one that they believe is against their country, their little country that they have over there in the Middle East to keep things straight, then I think we begin to understand what the demonstrators, the original demonstrators, if you will, the encampers, are facing. And I think that is the narrative from which we've got to view this, because that's how it's being rolled out in the media, Santita.
Absolutely. So, Bart Schultz, do you have a response to that?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, I think my views have for quite some time largely been in accord with those of a famous radical, well-known protester, Noam Chomsky, who has published extensively on how the United States has actually facilitated and enabled these disastrous decisions, policy decisions by Israel to avoid actually getting serious about a two-state solution and many other peace initiatives. So on that front, I'll leave it to your other distinguished guests here. I would just add too, though, that what I see on campus with the protesters is I can't help but interject here. It was such an honor to have your wonderful father there at the protest yesterday, and speaking about how important to stay nonviolent. Jesus loves Palestinians, and as always, imparting a really great message. One that the protesters were, I think, pretty much totally in accord with. I've had a number of those students in my classes, very, very bright, but also, very willing to dialogue, engage in dialogue, and hear a wide range of opinions. I find the media treatment of these protests just extremely distressing and misguided.
Why so?
Well, I mean, I think I can't help but quote a line or try to from Howard Zinn, who was a wonderful educator and published history of the United States and so forth, where he said, well, they accuse us of disrupting the peace, but the truth is, they're just upset because we're disrupting the war. And that's really the bottom line. So if you don't keep that perspective right, keep your priorities straight, this will look too like some kind of radical action on the part of people who are simply really overwhelmingly concerned to prevent genocide and save children and so forth. And like the list of demands that the Students for Justice in Palestine are making here, demands for divestment and so forth, they don't get the same coverage, the same detailed coverage. I think that so many of the critics get. And so I feel like the more press that actually gets directed to the voices of the protesters, the better. And unfortunately, here I will speak to some of the problems with universities and colleges in general. You can't, I sympathize with the news media in some respects because it's very hard to get inside the bubble of a place like the University of Chicago. We have what is called a news office, but it isn't really a news office. It's a public relations office, right? And they just always publish stories about the awards that faculty members get and so forth. And it's like being in this big smiley face bubble, right? If you want to know about the politics that's going on here, look at the student newspaper, right? Or talk to the students, or, talk to independent journalists, who are actually willing to go out and talk about the political issues and the difficulties and the ways in which, the University of Chicago is very, very far from politically neutral, never has been. I don't think it can be. If I saw some, sample of the Board of Trustees showing up down there to support the protesters or encampment, I might believe that, we had more of a wide-ranging political profile. But you don't, and you won't. So sorry, I packed a lot in there, but
Dr. Schultz, I have a question
for
you.
To think of universities and colleges as, just out there on the free speech front, whatever we may say.
So, in other campuses, Dr. Schultz, there's been indication that the narrative, unlike what Attorney Jones has mentioned, has been anti-Semitism, and of course, when they're pro-Israeli protesters, they've indicated that there's even some use in their voice of anti-Black slurs. I'm not sure why Black people are now involved in this, but there's been attacks on Black women. There have been attacks using racial slurs that are
Yeah.
demonstrative in nature. I just don't understand why students would bring it to the N word, right? In order to
Are you serious
contextualize
right
their
now?
argument. I
I
don't want
don't
to use the
either.
word.
Those
I
are
don't want
not
to
my
use the word
students.
Thor.
And in my experience, that's not the voice of the protesters at all. The wonderful
Okay.
student who was on Rainbow Push Morning broadcast just yesterday, was actually a Black student from Auburn Gresham, and Native American student, and was a wonderful spokesperson for the views of the students. And when you start looking at the intersectionality of the kinds of injustices we're looking at, right, you're going to see how you have to link so many different causes in opposition to oppression, racism, and so many other.
But why would pro-Israeli protesters, why would they choose to use such slurs?
Because of white racism. Many of them identify as white people.
But if
And
Israel,
no, and they feel themselves to be superior to Black people. That's how white racism works. And that's it. And the thing is, we can't dance around that. Not when they're spitting in the faces of Black
Yeah.
demonstrators. Not when they are trying to provoke, because everybody has got a point at which they can snap. And when you call a Black person, when you look them in the eye and call them the N word, and you spit at them, and then you lurch at them aggressively, as this boxer did in Los Angeles, you are begging for a physical confrontation, and then a melee and a riot could ensue. But let us not act as if that has not been an issue between and amongst Blacks and the Jewish community in the United States. Black Jewish people in Israel have a problem with white racism. That's real. And so that's all that we are seeing. So we shouldn't go like, oh, for sure, I can't believe this. Of course it's happening. And you know what? We need to talk about it. Put it all out there on the table.
No, violent white supremacism right now is, if you're looking at catastrophic threats and risks, what's happening in the United States is certainly up there. And the kind of polarization and, militaristic activities of these white supremacist groups is frightening. I think, though, it's important to bear in mind, too, that the overt signs of that are, can somewhat deflect attention from a very, very pervasive problem. I have a colleague here, Robert Pape, who studies, and a number of historians here as well, who study white supremacist groups in the United States, and who was at the January 6th insurrection and things like that. And, the surprising thing is a lot of people who are there aren't, they're not fringe. They're middle class, and they wouldn't be the ones to advertise their racism, but it's definitely there. And so the pervasiveness and insidiousness of white racism, I think, isn't captured by an incidence of spitting, horrible as that is. It's much more systemic. It's tied, of course, to patriarchalism and many other issues, I think, with respect to the kind of dominant culture, unfortunately, we're dealing with.
Period. Dr. Gibbs?
Yeah, I was going to just add to that I think that part of the perception of this country among those who are sort of the counter demonstrators, as we call them here, is that the Palestinians are, not perceived as a white people. They're a non-white people. And so when I hear the N-word, to some extent, I wonder if part of that part of that at least is directed also against the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
And what there's the perception of Israel, and it's not really entirely accurate, but there is a perception of Israel, including among its supporters, quite clearly, as a white country, a European outpost in the Middle East. In fact, the Jewish community is much more divided, as we've noted. There are black Jews, there are brown Jews, the Mizrahi Jews. About 50% of the Jewish Israelis are from the Middle East, Africa, Asia region, and most of them actually are not white. But nevertheless, the perception of Israel, and to some extent, I think their self-perception of Israel is like a European outpost in the Middle East. An element of the civilized world, to use the 19th century term, in the Middle East. I think that's much of Israel's self-perception and the perception of its supporters here. And I think that is part of the picture in terms of the counter-demonstrators as well. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to sign off at this point, but it's been a pleasure, as always, being with all of you. Thank you very much. And
thank you. Dr. David Gibbs, and the name of your book, and when will it be out?
Yes, it's called Revolt of the Rich, How the Politics of the 1970s Widened American Class Divide. It'll be published at the end of this month.
And we're going to get him to Chicago.
That'd be great.
Professor Schultz, so that we can we want him here during the convention.
That'll be exciting.
Talk about revolt. Oh my God.
I remember the 68 one quite well, actually.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm going to ask you about that as Dr. Gibbs signs off. Sending you so much love and blessings to you. Thank you. I mean, do you think that what we're watching now is a harbinger of what we might see in Chicago in August? Professor Schultz?
One can't help but worry that, the position that the Biden administration has found itself in, right, has such eerie similarities to LBJ's, with some great policies, but
take us back, because that's something, honestly, that those of us on the panel, we missed that.
Well, at the risk of aging myself in the extreme, I feel like I'm closer to your father's age group.
But this is where, and that's why I asked him, and I asked my mother, and I asked people who lived through that moment. Number one, how'd you get through? I mean, when I think back to the end of March and the first week of April of 1968, I asked you had at the beginning of the week, LBJ say, I will not accept, I'm not going to run, I won't accept the nomination. 4 days later, Dr. King is shot. 6 weeks later, RFK is shot. And I remember someone was asking my father just how he got through the King assassination. And my father was talking. He said, we just had to keep pushing because I had to come back here. We had these Saturday morning meetings. We were organized it. And he kept on going, talk. And they posed the question again. We were doing one of the radio shows. And I was in the studio with him. And Professor Schultz, I put my hand on my father's hand, Attorney Jones and Attorney Sinat. And publicly, he's reverend, because I respect the institution. But I had to say, Daddy.
I know that's right.
How did you get through this? Because when our father would come home from out of town, we would run down the hallway in our apartment that we lived in at the time. And we just jump, on our father, who's a big guy. As you know, he's a big guy. So it's like, this time our mother had us stay in our room and we could not leave. Because she had gone to the airport to get him. And she brought him back. And it took her a while, as I have the recall of a child, for us to go in and see him. She said, well, I didn't want you to see him because he would not take off the shirt and there was blood all over. And she said, and he wouldn't take off his shades. She said, because he couldn't stop crying and he was in shock. And I couldn't bring a 4, 3, and 2-year-old into the room because he wasn't your dad then.
Right.
He was someplace, he wasn't here. But I was trying to, I had our pastor come over And even though we had a house, an apartment full of people,
Yeah.
I had to bring him back so he could be prepared to. And we hugged him before the night was over. But she said he was in a state of shock we were all in a state of shock, but we had to go on because we knew that we would have let Dr. King down if we had not moved forward, but it was just a lot. And so the reason I think we're all curious to ask you about this is because now we're leaning on your wisdom. Because you're saying, wait a minute, you keep, those of you who lived through the 68 convention, you keep saying they're flashing lights here, you all. We better understand with the city council shutting down Chicago. There are places where we're not, more and more places we're not going to be able to protest. That protest is going to go somewhere. Professor.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, your experience growing up with that and with your father and so forth, certainly, is way beyond anything I could report. And
the road not traveled, right, Professor Schultz?
Yeah, that's that's
your book, Soror.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just in amazement at your father and your entire family, really, for all of the things that you've done. And I can't thank you, honor you enough. He always had my vote. That is your father, the Reverend.
Well, it's like Noam Chomsky, I'm sure.
But the question is, Professor Schultz, are the protesters going to University of Chicago? Will they be on your campus or will they be downtown Chicago? Will they be on your campus?
Yeah.
I certainly hope so. I mean, I might add, I can add a little bit here. I mean, I was really delighted to hear Jonathan yesterday speaking on the morning broadcast, and then also he came over to campus later in the day, and but he I think I heard him right. He said one thing that really I felt like I had to speak up about, but the opportunity didn't present itself. He said he'd done a little research and that the University of Chicago didn't have this history of protest. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, it was something, I think what he was referring to was, I think there was such a push, I think when our father arrived on the campus.
Yeah.
And they had more space coming out of seminary because that's where our father did his seminary work.
Right.
And they got a tremendous amount of support for the work that they were doing. Like they were testing out the fair housing laws. I mean, that was part of their prac when they were.
Right.
I mean, the seminary was very engaged in the community, and so I can see you probably taking umbrage with that.
Well, I appreciated the the great things that CTS was doing with supporting various programs, but I mean, it was in that context, as you say, like in slightly earlier than that, 62, 63, when Bernie Sanders was here, and he was actively protesting with lots of students because the university was engaged in racial discrimination in the housing that it controlled in the neighborhood, and Bernie's actually been doing these videos and sending out messages in support of the current protests from the SJP and other groups across the country. And he vividly recalls those days and the fates of the university that actually met with very significant student protests. In 1969, of course, students took over the administration building. And that was in connection with the firing of this faculty member who was politically radical. That, too, is something that there's been a long history of here. If you don't mind my being a little academic.
No,
At this point, I have to drag in a book, and
I love it.
prior reading.
Something that we can Amazon, calling Amazon, and I'm going to welcome Trinice from FAMU, another HBCU. That's right. I love it. I love it. I love it. From the Youth
Go
Action.
PWI.
Huh.
Go PWI.
No. HBCU. Go HBCU.
No, it's also
No
love. It's
no
also
seminary,
love.
co-op, bookstore. Okay.
Right? Bradley
We do
University.
still have.
Peoria, Illinois.
Actually, now
Right.
it's a nonprofit. I take it back. We don't have any co-ops anymore. But
Well, what book is this?
a couple of things. First off,
Okay.
I mean, I think this is. I'm sure some your father and so many members of your family have lived. I wish, though, that
Well, we all
more
grew up on the
protesters would avail themselves of Gene Sharp's Waging Nonviolent Struggle, which really goes over, in great detail how to move from protest and persuasion to non-cooperation to nonviolent intervention. And, I mean, when you come up with 198 ways to engage in nonviolent protest, right? You have many, many options out there. And I worry at this point that, given the types of repression that we're seeing with against the student protesters, that there will be a serious need to get creative with continuing the momentum. The book I was going to mention, though, and anyone interested in the University of Chicago should read two books. One, Making the Second Ghetto by Arnold Hirsch, which is a real classic and really lays out the story of the university's very far from neutral policies with respect to urban renewal, and before that, restrictive covenants. A book that goes back a little further, though, and one I always like to direct people to, is Robert Westbrook's John Dewey and American Democracy. John Dewey, probably everybody knows the name, is one of the most famous educators and philosophers of education that in the world. Undoubtedly the most illustrious philosopher we ever had at the University of Chicago. He was here from 10 years, from 1894 on, and was the founder of the University Lab Schools, actually, which still has, quotations from him emblazoned on the walls and so forth. And what I would really like to drive home to people is that Dewey was probably the most radical philosopher we've ever had at the University of Chicago. He was a democratic socialist. He'd be voting for Bernie Sanders. He was actually an agitator. He commented often on the failures of the University of Chicago to really welcome free speech. And thought that Jane Addams's famous Hull House, that settlement house, where UIC is now, was a much freer environment. Jane Addams's Hull House, right? They were inviting in people like the anarchist Kropotkin and Eugene Debs and W.E.B. Du Bois and all of that. A lot of people who weren't really welcome at the University of Chicago. And one of the lessons they point out here, Westbrook points out, is that the university actually, the trustees did early on interfere, with on political issues affecting the faculty. So there was a pretty well-known economist here, Edward Bemis, who was a student of corporate corruption. He came here with great fanfare, knew a lot about labor movements and so forth. And Bemis made the mistake of being on the side of the workers and Eugene Debs during the 1894 Pullman strike, which was, of course, a defining moment in labor history. And Dewey certainly thought on good grounds that that cost him his job at the University of Chicago.
Well, then let me ask you this. I mean, we've got a couple of minutes before we break here and go into the second hour. Has that I understand that the students are talking with the administration now.
Yeah.
Do you think that, because the University of Chicago is a mixed bag. I mean, it's like it's the center of sociology and economics in the
Yeah.
United States and the world. I mean, that's what they do, right? I mean, I think that's part of the reason that my father excelled.
That's why I always go
senator.
back to John Dewey.
Yeah, I mean, because
Yeah.
because so much of his work intersects there.
Yeah.
And just it was always it was a tremendous academic environment in which he was able to flower, although they did not like his preaching.
Right.
But
Right.
that you love those things. But just help me to understand just very quickly, how are the students being treated now? Well, you know what, hold that till we get to the other side. Hold that. Because with, interesting, this is a very interesting institution. Greg Palast went there.
Yeah.
Reverend Jesse Jackson went there. Bernie Sanders went there.
Bernie Sanders.
You are there. I mean, being aligned philosophically politically with a Noam Chomsky, it gives you that room, and then it has people on the far right economically. I mean, it's just, it's really a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And it's also a Rockefeller built institution. So there's that.
Yeah. Divesting from fossil fuels means divesting from.
I don't know how that's going to happen, but I mean, I want us to talk about how the students are faring. And when we get on the other side, Trinice, we're going to hear from you, because it's a mixed bag. But these institutions are so heavily invested in oil, in gas, and that's where Israel is. It's different than South Africa, because you're touching a lot of power centers when you're dealing with Israel. You're looking at France and Germany and the United Kingdom and the United States having a real vested interest in keeping that beachhead in Israel, because after the Second World War, oil was king. And we had to find a way, you threw out Mossadegh and, in Iran, and we put in the Shah. We've been moving over there for a minute, but the people are moving in another direction today.
Well, we hope.
Well, you're right.
We hope that there's a.
Well, it does. Well, hold on. It's Springs Eternal. We're going to go back, and I want you to take that link. Everybody, please stay with us. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to bring Shanice in on the other side. She's a student at FAMU. We're going to have some University of Chicago students for Justice in Palestine. We want to talk about what's happening with the students, because Attorney Jones, it seems that the students and Attorney Sanat, and you see this because, looking at the news, Professor Schultz, they're being mischaracterized. And then they have guns drawn on them.
Well, they're being mischaracterized by our university president, and too much of the media follows suit.
Well, now there's that, and they're protesting literally while snipers are on roofs. Well, I mean, they literally have guns surrounding them. And when you have these counter protesters who are trying to provoke this kind of violence, it is worrying where this can go when these young people are peaceful.
Right.
That's something that we're not. If you listen to call-in shows on radio and television, that's not really coming through, because the corporate media are doing quite the job of painting them as violent and extreme. These are kids who are functioning in many cases, under hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. They don't have time for this, but they are putting their future employment on the line.
Yeah.
To take this stand. And I think we need to talk about that.
Absolutely.
So, and I want to know from you, Attorney Jones, what their rights are as people, as alumni are threatening them with, I want to get your name, and I'm going to tell my friends not to give you a job. That's happening as we speak. So stand by, everybody. More of the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Let's talk about what's happening with these students. Do you even know what they're asking for? Do you know that these encampments are very peaceful? Do you know how violent the counter protesters are? We're not even hearing who they are, but we know who they are. They're on film, for heaven's sake. They've been videoed. We know who they are. Why aren't we discussing them? We need to talk about that. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show in this magnificent panel. Oh, Soror, I can't believe it. She's quiet right now, but just hold on. We're gonna be back in a minute. She got something to say.
I'm here. I'm here.
And I love Attorney Sinat. That's my girl. Ooh, ooh. Back in with more of the Santita Jackson.